through the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. A couple of questions from last week that we can pick up on, and observations that people have made. One is, I was asked why, John, you asked me why the angels around the throne of heaven rotate or process counterclockwise. And the truthful answer is I don't know. But interestingly, Frank had an observation or a thought while he was listening to that the earth rotates around the sun counterclockwise. The planet's orbit around the sun is counterclockwise. I have no idea if that's related, but it's intriguing because recall that for the ancients, when they looked up into the sky and they saw celestial bodies, they associated those lights, the celestial lights, with angelic presences, with angelic beings. And so it's not too far-fetched to suggest that the movement of the universe being counterclockwise is also expressed in the movement of the angelic beings around the light who gives life to all, not the sun, right, but the Lord Jesus Christ, which is interesting because in the book of Genesis, the sun is not made on the first day before plant life. The light that comes into the world is the light of God, and that's what gives life, and it's only later that the sun shows up. And the ancients would have been very, very aware that for other ancient peoples, it's the sun that drives the energy of life. And they were saying, no, it's God. So all life revolves around God. So that's one sort of intriguing thought. The other thing I wanted to follow up on, I meant to say a little bit more about the color of vestments and vestments in general. I emphasized last week that in the ancient practice of the church, there's only really two colors that we follow in the liturgical year. There's bright and there's dark. And as I said to the Byzantines, bright really meant something very multicolored and festal, and dark meant something much more subdued and penitential. So the dark tended to be what we call royal purple, which we will don in just a couple weeks. And bright could be anything else, almost. Bright could be red and blue and green and gold and silver and white all mixed together, very rarely monochromatic. So the question I wanted to raise and to follow up on, though, is, well, why do we have then, in our rubrics book, it says, for these feasts it's blue, for the Theotokos, for these feasts it's green, for Pentecost. And why do we have a sort of monochrome color palette in our modern day rubrics? The simple answer to that is that that was a Latin practice that was adopted into the East, probably around the time of the Ottoman invasion of Greece, when a lot of Greek clergy were sent to Italy for their education, when the Ottomans shut down all the seminaries in Greece and in the East. And so there was a lot of cross communication between Orthodoxy and the Latin tradition at that time. So we're talking in the 15th, 16th centuries. And it's likely that that's where that first level of moving away from a purely Byzantine bright, dark color scheme to our monochromatic color schemes. In Russia as well, I don't know this, but it's likely that in the reforms and influence of Peter the Great, who was trying to make Russia in general much more European, it's possible that he also influenced the church to adopt some of these monochromatic color patterns, which we use to this day, and I have no problem. I'm not raising this as like it's not an issue. It's still a beautiful thing. Color is color, whether it's bright green or bright gold or bright white, it's all bright. So it still follows the same principles, but those are just curious historical things that occur. The other thing about vestments, though, that I want to emphasize is that vestments are highly iconographic and very much related to the things we're talking about here. If, when we look at the light of Pascha coming out, when we look at the censing of the temple, the deacon going counterclockwise around the altar, and by the way, that was another point we could make. The initial censing, I think Scott mentioned to me, well, we go clockwise around the church. We don't go counterclockwise around the church when we cense it. Actually, I think what is there is that we always start counterclockwise and then we go sort of free form. Because what the deacon will do is he'll sense the altar counterclockwise, but then he'll go clockwise and sense the rest of the altar. And so really, once we get to the sensing of the space, which is the rest of the altar after the altar table and the space, we actually move in multiple patterns. If you have two deacons, they're actually going, again, against each other, if you are parallel to each other. So there's no strict counterclockwise rule about that. It's that we are spreading the fragrance of paradise out into the world, and this is the world, but also out into the narthex. Where are we going with that? That was a sidebar. I was talking about vestments. Oh, in all of this, we have vestments, right? We don't wear golf attire when we're doing these things. And there's meaning to the vestments. There's extraordinary meaning to the vestments. And I think one of the things that's interesting is if there are books written about vestments and the historical origins of vestments, and one of the curious things that they tend to do is that they say, well, it seems like the early Christian vestments followed the patterns of the daily dress of Rome, okay? So they'll identify that some of these things that the clergy or the deacons wear are things that your average sort of nobleman would wear in early Rome, your senator, that sort of thing. And likewise, when the capital of the Roman Empire moves to Constantinople and we have what's called the Byzantine Court, somewhat problematically, but the notion is, well, the Byzantine Court had these kinds of clothes, and the clergy were sort of brought into the Byzantine Court, and they adopted those same, clothing patterns. And the Byzantine Court was also fond of processions and ascensions, and so the liturgy took on processions and ascensions. And so you read this and you think, okay, so there isn't a meaning to Orthodox vestments. There isn't a meaning to liturgical vestments. We just adopted what other people were wearing at the time. And that's exactly the logic that many other Christians use today when they don't wear these beautiful, bright vestments, the Thelonian with the high back and all these different things. They do indeed wear golf attire in many churches around the world today for this very reason that scholarship says the early Christians simply adopted the normal dress and dressed it up a little bit. Here's why, though, that's very problematic. It's an example of a rather astonishing anachronism in scholarship regarding the meaning of vestments and the origin of vestments. And the anachronism is this. The assumption is, well, if we think that people were wearing clothes like this in a political, civil ceremony or political, civil context, and then we see similarities to what the church is wearing, then the church must have simply adopted civic patterns or regular social patterns. That's the anachronism right there. That's the anachronism. And we've already talked about this in this book, The Ancient City, that in the ancient world, it was worship that established the civic space, not the civic space that influenced the worship. To be even more exact, there was no distinction between worship and civic. That is the true anachronism right there. The idea that there is a political setting, and there is a social setting, and there's the market setting, and then there's, religious people. And the religious people simply imitate what they see other people doing. That's the anachronism. To the ancient world, it was a complete integration. The emperor was divine. We've heard that before, right? We've ever heard the Roman emperor declared himself a god. Caligula declared himself a god. Well, that was not rare in the ancient world, because if you were a king, you were first a priest. Always a king and a priest. Remember our discussion about Melchizedek, right? The king of Salem and the priest of the Most High God. This is the ancient pattern, that to be a king and a leader of people is to be the one who keeps their worship. And it is the worship that defines everything else. So this gets very interesting when we get to the Byzantine imperial court. I'll get to that in a second. By the way, this is a very interesting thing. Early Christians were considered by the Romans atheists. We have documentary evidence of the Roman writers calling early Christians atheists. The reason why they considered Christians atheists is that they would not worship the Roman gods. All right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean like Zeus and Hera and Apollo and all these different characters that we have. It means a number of things. It depends in a large measure on what city are you in, because what city you're in determines what God you worship. But the Christians worshiped only the God, the Father, the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but they refused to participate in the worship of the city. And that's what made them atheists, you see. This is very, very important. To the ancient people, worship was everything. All right, we said that, I know, ad nauseum. But this gets very important in the Byzantine imperial court, because it's always been perplexing to historians why, when Constantine becomes emperor of Rome, he very swiftly moves the capital of the empire from the city of Rome to this little village called Byzantium on the Bosphorus, which would become Constantinople, and which we know today as Istanbul. And the question is why? With all the import and power of the city of Rome, right? The eternal city, why on earth, if you are an emperor, do you move the capital from this great city to this little village? Well, there's a number of different theories that they evince. They suggest that at that point already, most of the geopolitical threats to the Roman Empire were coming farther from the east, and that it would be helpful to have the capital there to shore up that edge of the empire and push back the various military threats. And what were some of the others? The most important one is the one that's pertinent to our discussion. There's always been a recognition, at least amongst Orthodox scholars, that what was peculiar about this little village called Byzantium is that it was purely Christian. Byzantium was a Christian settlement on the Bosphorus, and it had no history of pagan worship. It had no establishing worship in the typical pattern of the ancient world, which is first you have a priest who establishes worship, he becomes a king, a city builds up around people's adoption of that common worship, etc. Byzantium did not have that. It was Christian. And the problem is they stopped there. What does that really mean? It means that it was Christian worship that established Byzantium, the village, the small town. And it was therefore Constantine moving the capital of the entire empire to a place where the only ritual that was foundational to that geographical space was in fact Christian ritual. It is not the Byzantine imperial court that later Christians are imitating in Vestments. It is the Christian worship that the Byzantine imperial court is adopting as its establishing principle of liturgy and worship and ritual. And again, we're going back to that book, The Ancient City, and I think that is so eye-opening because the ancients thought so differently than we do about these things. But it's Christian worship that established the culture of the Byzantine imperial court, and I would even argue that it is the patterns of Eastern Christian worship that establish also many of the court rituals of processions. So when we look at our own processions, which is what we've been talking about so far, the procession of light, the procession of incense, when we look at those processions, we're not looking at an imitation of a political order. We're seeing something much deeper and more ancient than that. In fact, what more modern scholarship, current day scholarship is finding more and more, is that all of these elements are amply present in a combination of temple worship of the Jews as well as Merkava mysticism, which is a form of Jewish mysticism, predating a lot of the stuff that used to animate scholars. Oh, that's Neoplatonism. They adopted that later on. And this assumption that Christians just come along and imitate the culture. Again, this is very, very important stuff, because a lot of Christians do believe that you've got to constantly be adapting worship to imitate culture. If the culture says rock music is what young people like, then you better put rock music in the church, because that's what the church has always done. And what I'm suggesting to you and saying emphatically to you is that is not true. That is not true. Perhaps most galling of these false notions of where our practices come from is the degree to which they ignore things that are amply present in the scriptures themselves, specifically the prophetic tradition. When Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 6, sees the angel coming out of the Holy of Holies from heaven and bringing out the little scroll to eat, that is an image of a procession. It's very much a part of the prophetic understanding of divine worship, of heavenly worship. As we mentioned last week, and as we'll see in the first Sunday of Great Lent, Jacob's ladder. Jacob seeing the angels of God ascending and descending. That is a biblical pattern that we see replicated and entered into every single service that we have. Every time there is an entrance, we are seeing the same thing Jacob saw. We are seeing the same thing that Jesus promises Nathanael, that he will see greater things than this. You will see the heavens open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man, right? So that forms the foundation of our understanding of these things. So getting back for a moment to vestments, vestments are highly iconographic, and they're meant to communicate to us that we are in the heavenly places, that the high priest is present. The particularity of the bishop's vestments are the vestments of the high priest. And you notice when you see icons of Christ, the high priest, he is vested as a bishop. The priests and the deacons and others really are iconographically projecting a sense of the presence of the angelic hosts moving around the altar, okay? So all of our vestments have immense meaning, and I know that there's perhaps some, question, well, why do some priests wear hats and other priests don't wear hats? And sometimes it's a simple case of, well, my head gets hot and I don't want to wear it, Or there are generations that said, oh, we find that all fussy and too much, and don't strut around like a peacock. That's not the idea of vestments. We should be simple and we should be plain and that sort of thing. I was really admonished, by my spiritual father about this. When we are given things to wear, when we are awarded things in the church, and this big sort of burgundy hat, for instance, is one example, it really shouldn't be a question of whether I want to wear it or not, or whether it's comfortable for me to wear or not, or whether I'm being vain or humble by wearing it. It's a question of what does it speak iconographically to the gathering. And these things come from very deep and ancient places. Yes, there are differences in hats and there are differences in vestments, and we always make an emphasis that the Greeks wear the low backs and the Russians wear the high backs. That's not even I'm talking about the Phalonian, and that's not even an accurate understanding, because on Mount Athos they also wear high backs. And so all that stuff about the high back being about how it's cold in the great north of Russia, and they put the Phalonian up higher to sort of protect their neck from the weather, does not make any sense once you realize that on Mount Athos they were wearing those much earlier. Although it can get really cold on Mount Athos too. But that, again, practical considerations like that have nothing to do with it. These are all elements that indicate rank, and rank in hierarchy is a very much a part of heavenly vision, and everything we do in our worship is expressive of heavenly vision, right? So what's important is that when we gather here and when we see movement and we see procession and we see vestments and we see incense and light and all these things coming, it's all following a pattern. It's all following the paradigm of what heavenly worship is, so that even things like the beauty of the vestments and then the embellishments of wearing hats and other things hanging off of you, it's not a question of vanity or humility. It's a question of iconography. It's a question of hierarchy, of rank. And Dionysius the Areopagite wrote extensively about this in the Celestial Hierarchy. I wanted to actually read something from him, getting back to the question of light. I'll do that in a moment. But it's not a matter of, am I humble and therefore I don't wear this, or am I vain and therefore I wish to strut around like a peacock. It's about obedience. It's about iconography, right? Now, I will say this, generationally, there are different ways of thinking about these things. Because some clergy are very comfortable wearing a collar and a suit in public, and other clergy are comfortable wearing, or not comfortable, but feel like they should wear the cassock. And I know for all of us, that's a hard thing. Some people are embarrassed if they see a priest in public wearing a cassock. Why are you doing that? Why are you calling attention to yourself? You know, I've heard priests say, I'm too humble to wear a cassock in public. I wear the collar, you know. And again, I think what's important is that there are pastoral reasons why we make decisions like that. And of course, a lot of it has to do with what our bishops describe. But there are also and always spiritual reasons. There are many holy saints that have described the spiritual beauty of the cassock, that it's not merely a garment that they used to wear that we still wear in our stubborn traditionalism, that there is a spiritual dimension to the cassock, and that the privilege of being given the cassock and then wearing the cassock is greater than your own opinions about whether it's vain or humble or whatever else, or embarrassing to wear the cassock. And it's mostly embarrassing, I will tell you that. Wearing the cassock in public invites far more scorn than it invites anything like respect, right? And I know that that's probably why it's hard for all of us. If we're used to seeing a certain generation of clergy that wore the cassock, or not the cassock, the collar and the suit, okay, we look like we belong. But when we see a priest in the cassock and we kind of look behind him and everyone's kind of, you know, making faces like, who does this guy think he is, you know? We all know what that's like. It is a burden to wear it in public. It's a cross to wear it in public. But it's also an act of obedience, and for many it would be stated that it's an image of spiritual presence pointing beyond the person wearing the cassock and to the priesthood of Christ. And that's what we're always doing. If we wear the cassock in public as an expression of the mission of the gospel, as a way of saying something greater is here, right? The something greater that Nathaniel was told that he will see, then it doesn't matter how I feel about whether people are rolling their eyes at me. Or coming up and saying, oh, Father, it's so good to see a priest in this public place. I've had that too. I had, one time I was in Walmart in Blacklick, I guess it was in Blairsville, and a gentleman in plain clothes saw me, and he came up to me, and he identified himself. He was actually a Roman Catholic priest, but he's like, oh, it's so good to see, you know, a priest dressed like this in Walmart. And then he goes to shake my hand, and he leaves something behind and walks away, and I look down, and it's a $100 bill. I go, that's I'll wear the cassock everywhere if that's what's But he was so touched by that. And I had my two, Alexander and Rachel were very little when we were in Blacklick. That wasn't long after we left here 20 years ago. So, but the cassock, the hats, the vestments, all of those things, they all express something very powerful, that this is the heavenly places, that these processions are the processions of the angels around the throne of God. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's an option. Yeah, absolutely. So, for instance, I have my green vestments are low back. They're Greek style, we would say. Technically, the vestments you see me, like the vestments I'll wear today, are technically Athonite style. In other words, the tailor that makes those vestments, she makes Greek vestments, low back, and Athonite. And the Athonite have the higher raised collar. But it is purely, unless your bishop tells you you have to wear this style and I won't permit anything else, it is purely up to the priest what style he wishes to wear. And so that's another example where for us it's important for us not to have opinions about what we prefer, what we like. Oh, he's wearing low back. That's not good. Or, oh, he's wearing high back. Who does he think he is? That the main question is what is being communicated to us by the beauty of the vestments. Yeah. Father, yeah? Yeah. Yes. Yes. And that again is so the question is Father Florowski wearing his cassock everywhere that he went. That too is somewhat, depending on what your bishop tells you as a priest, is somewhat a personal choice. For instance, in the Diocese of the South, it was, here I'm going to contradict myself, in the Diocese of the South, it was expected that the priests would wear the cassock in public everywhere they went. That was the expectation. There was no blessing in the Diocese of the South to wear a collar and a suit, right? And largely because that's really a Western practice. It's not really an Orthodox practice to wear a suit and collar. That's a Western practice. So Archbishop Dimitri of blessed memory simply blessed his clergy to wear what Orthodox clergy wear, which is the cassock. In most other dioceses, though, the bishop will say, wear either the cassock or the collar as you see fit. But in some cases, the bishops forbid the wearing of the cassock in public. The Antiochian Archdiocese, quite famously. I don't know if this has changed in more recent times, but the Antiochian Archdiocese, I think it was Metropolitan Philip, he actually issued a decree forbidding his clergy to wear the cassock in public. And largely that was, there's all these, sometimes, as I said, we shouldn't have too strong opinions about this thing. We should simply ask ourselves, what is the church communicating to us through these things? Sometimes people do get very strong opinions and they start fighting, and we want to wear the collar because we don't want to look goofy in public. We should wear the cassock because it's the ancient Orthodox Christian tradition. And they're at each other, and the bishop says, enough with all of you. Everyone's going to wear the collar. When you get into the church, put on your cassock. When you leave the church, have your collar and your suit on. And so he actually forbade them from wearing the cassock. And in that instance, I mean, if you're a priest, you have to do what your bishop has instructed you to do. You don't have a choice. This same debate occurred historically at St. Vladimir Seminary. If you're a seminarian at St. Tikhon's, when you matriculate, they give you a cassock. So just being a seminarian, an MDiv student at St. Tikhon's, you get the cassock and you wear the cassock to class every day and around the campus. They had a sort of vitriolic debate at some point at St. Vladimir's, and they decided, okay, no cassocks. Student, if you're a priest or a deacon, you can wear the cassock, but students are going to wear just regular street clothes. They're not going to wear the cassock. And of course, when they're there, they have to obey. So there have always been clergy who have worn the cassock everywhere. There are clergy who are more comfortable wearing the collar, and if the bishop blesses that, hey, let it be blessed, and I'm not criticizing it. I'm simply pointing out that there's always more to these questions than sometimes the historical circumstances in which one is worn more prominently over the other. I would say that for me, especially in the South, wearing the collar in the Deep South was very difficult. I know this is probably hard for people to understand, but in a place like East Texas, and I know this is going out on YouTube, but East Texans know this, so what I'm about to say. But especially when we got there in 2008, we were in a state of culture shock about how openly anti-Catholic people tended to be in East Texas. Anti-Catholicism was still very much an accepted prejudice, and it was promoted by the sort of evangelical and fundamentalist churches there. They talked a lot about, I thank thee, O Lord my God, that I am not like those Catholics over there. And so it was very shocking, because when you're from a city like Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh's a very Catholic city, and we all know and love our friends and family members and neighbors who are Catholic. And so to go to a place like that, having been from here, where people are just really openly anti-Catholic, is shocking on one level. But then the other shocking thing is when we saw me in my cassock, right? They had no idea what I was. And if they came up and asked me, it was often with quite a bit of hostility. And at the end of those conversations, they still had no idea what I was, but they figured I must be at least as bad as the Catholics. So it was hard, and my kids saw that. My kids, oftentimes when we were walking through a store, I'd pick them up from school, I'd be in the grocery store, I'd have my cassock on. My kids would always be walking behind me, and they would notice what I did not notice. I just kind of did my business and tried to be polite and smile at people or whatever. But what my kids would notice is that as people would walk by me, they'd all turn around and give the look. You're like, what is that, you know? And I never saw that. I very rarely saw people giving me the look. My kids saw it every time, and they really noticed it, you know? And I don't know, it didn't seem to affect them negatively, but they saw a lot more than I did. Any other questions? These are, I know, sort of practical topics and interesting topics, but let me just say a few words then about the small entrance and the great entrance then. Well, I really don't have time to start there. Let me tell you what I want to do over our next 3 sessions. Our next 3 sessions, I want to shift gears a little bit towards Great Lent. And I'm still going to interweave the iconography and the experience of what it means to be in the church and what we're doing in worship. But we're going to talk about confession. We're going to talk about fasting as we prepare for the Great Fast. We're also going to talk about what it means to pray for the dead, because we have this series of liturgies in Great Lent and around Great Lent called memorial liturgies, in which we have lots of names written down and we make intercessions for our loved ones. So we really need to understand, what is it that we think we're doing there? What effect does it have on the dead to pray for them? And what is the meaning of that? And I promise you, I think the lists after that, the lists are going to get a lot longer when we start to realize what our responsibility to our deceased loved ones and ancestors are, because it's an immense, immense responsibility for us to pray for them. So those are 3 topics that we're going to do coming up, and I think what I'll do is I'll leave it at here. We'll have a few minutes here. It's almost 9:35. We'll start the hours in 5 minutes. I'll leave off here unless there's further questions, but I want to keep talking about this idea of movement in the liturgy. So we'll continue with that as we move to those other topics. Any other questions? Any thoughts? Any concerns?